Good evening. This week we have Parshas Vayeshev. Now, I wanted to mention, even though Hanukkah is not for another few days, and we will, for next week's Parshas Miketz, elaborate. Only once in 26 years is Miketz not the Shabbos Hanukkah Sedra. But all the other years it is. Sometimes we have two Shabbosos, the first day of Hanukkah and the last day, and then it's Vayeshev and it's Miketz. But Miketz is always sandwiched in, except for that one time in 26 years. Now, I wanted to say to you, this month is the month of Kislev. And it's interesting that, there are other months that have Yomim Tovim, but the distinguished position of Kislev is noteworthy because the way many of the Meforshim describe the month, like if someone is not sad and disappointed during Kislev, so he's zoichet to a lot more of the Or HaGonos of Hanukkah. There's so many statements that point to the special uniqueness of the month of Kislev. Now, Hanukkah in and of itself is the only Yom Tiv. Now, it's a D'Rabbanan. It's not a D'Oraisa like Pesach, Sukkot, or Shavuos. But we say, for instance, the whole Hallel. That is reserved for a pure Yom Tov. And even on Pesach, the last 6 days of Pesach, we do not say the 4 intermediate days of Chol HaMoed and the last day. We don't say a whole Hallel. We say only a half a Hallel, like we say on Rosh Chodesh. And even Sukkot, that we say a whole Hallel every single day, but there's only 7 days of Sukkot. Shmini Atzeres and Simchas Torah is a Yom Tov Bifnei Atzah. It's not Sukkot. It's Shmini Atzeres B'Yom HaShmini Atzeres Tiyeh Lochem. It's a so we really for Sukkot only say 7 days the whole Hallel. Yet Hanukkah, we say all 8 days. The entire Hallel, every day. Because the send-off into Golus was Hanukkah, which took place a couple hundred years after the Nes of Purim. And its uniqueness in the Medrash, when it says, people quote all the time that Purim, Liyasad Lavo, will not change its format, and the Mahus of Purim, after Mashiach comes, because it's the Olam HaKeser, and that's above. But there are also many opinions in the Medrash that Hanukkah will not change, because Hanukkah has a uniqueness that it was the last Yom Tov to be celebrated for Klal Yisrael and to carry them through the 2,000 years of Golus. And that's why Yaakov Avinu, who represents myriad, the darkness of the world, the golus of the world, the disappointments of the shibud and everything that goes with it, wanted to be connected. He was nifta the first day of Sukkot, that's his yortzeit. And look into the Bnei Yissaschar, how he elaborates on it. But it went and carried the 70 days in Parshas Vayechi, that it says that they mourned his Petira. Comes out the last day of the mourning for Yaakov is the first day of Hanukkah. because he wanted a kesher with Hanukkah, which was going to be the driving force and the backbone, the cementing factor of Klal Yisrael to carry them through Golus. And that's why Hanukkah was designated, as the Ramban talks about in Parshas Baaloscha, that the Or HaGonus that Aaron HaKohen brought into the menorah when he lit the menorah in that flame was the Or HaGonus, that special light that the world had when the world was created, but it was taken away because Adam HaRishon ate from the Eitz Hadas and he was driven out of Gan Eden. And the light that we have outside is not the original light of the world, like the Zohar HaKadosh says, that why does every creation say Vayehi Chen? And it answers and says, because if it stayed, it was created and remained like the trees and the oceans and the grass and the everything. It said in the pasuk Vayehi Chen. But since the Or did not remain, and there's a substitute darker Or that we see as light outside today till Mashiach comes, it says Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or, Vayehi Or, not Vayehi Chen. That's what the Zohar Kodesh answers and says Mishum Delo Hava Chen, because it wasn't so, because it didn't continue to be. But Aaron HaKohen, through his tremendous kavanah, brought back that power of the Or HaGonus into his lighting of the menorah, and he wanted it to be so powerful that 1650 years later, when the Ness of Hanukkah would take place, that when Yidden would light their menorahs, there would be in the actual flame the Or HaGonus. And as I said to you last year, that's why people are told, Shulchan Aruch says, you shouldn't just light and run away. You're supposed to sit there and look for 20 minutes, a half an hour, and just stare and absorb and become drenched your neshamas with that Or HaGonus, which even by Ner Shabbos, there's no Indian of sitting there. Women sit and say their tefillas and tchinas and bakoshes, but it's not something that Shulchan Aruch says that you have to sit there and watch. But by Hanukkah, we do. Now, I want to say to you that the nest that took place Hanukkah, there was that the Pach Shel Shemen, that it lasted, and of course it's the famous kasha, that why do we have 8 days of Hanukkah, why not just 7? Because the first day was not a miracle, there was enough oil for the first day. But we know that Hanukkah, because it has the Or HaGonus, it's in the realm of Shmini, which is Lamala Min HaTeva. There's no 8 days in this world. There's 7 days of the week. That's it. The 8th day, that's Lamala Min HaTeva. And because the Or HaGonus is prevalent, therefore we are sent and driven into the realm. We're drenched in the realm of the Or HaGonus, and there's 8 days. It's one of the reasons the Satmar Rebbe, Zecher Tzadik V'Kodesh Levracha, used to every night Hanukkah for 60 years say a different teretz on this kasha of why is Hanukkah 8 days and not 7. Now, but the other part of the Nes was the fact that they won the war. If you look in Parshas Zos HaBracha, at the pasuk Umesanov min Yekumun, in the last words of Moshe Rabbeinu to Klal Yisrael, the second pshat in Rashi says that it is a reference to the Bnei Chashmonoi. And Rashi says that there were 12 Bnei Chashmonoi who fought the war, and Elazar plus the 12, it was 13. So can you imagine coming up to an army of 80,000 or 60,000? Whether it's 13 or whatever number, it was an open miracle that they won. And the question asked is, why do we give such commemoration and credit? Because it says that these Bnei Chashmonai were Kohanim. And after the war was won, they continued being kings. Now, the Geder of kings was given to Yehuda, not to Levi, not to the Kohanim. And the Gemara says that because they kept the leadership and the royalty of Malchus, they died out completely. So we see there was a tremendous criticism to them. So if they were really on the wrong side of the fence, ask the Meforshim, why is there such commemoration and so much fame and posture given to the Bnei Chashmonai? And the Meforshim answered that yes, when the story was over, they did something wrong, and that they really should never have touched again, one day, Malchus, kingship. But because they didn't want to give it up, they died out. But for what they did up to that point, we don't come to someone who did tremendous in his lifetime and then suddenly detours and say, oh, now you're not so good, so everything else before is wiped out, erased. We don't say that. The credit which is due for a noble act, and they were moiser nefesh fully, that they went out to fight with such emunah that they won. But under normal, natural circumstances, would they ever have won? But because of that emunah and mesiras nefesh, we commemorate, we celebrate, and we give such boundless credit to the Bnei Chashmonai. Afterwards, they made a mistake and they paid with their lives. But for all the good that they did, we don't forget it for a moment. And it's 1900 years since the story of Hanukkah. And we're still celebrating and commemorating and the inyan of Simcha, Lahodos u'Lahalel, exist in its full flourish for Klal Yisrael. Now, Hanukkah as I said, was the last Yom Tov to carry us throughout Golus. It was our valises and our suitcases to be filled with enough tzeda l'dorach, enough food for our trip, enough possession in Ruchnias to be able to withstand all of the Golusin and all of the difficulties of pulling through. I mean, just look, the anti-Semitism is not something that we're talking about that happened 500 years ago. It's going on full force, even today. But Hanukkah sustained us and was the backbone of Klal Yisrael's existence. And that's the reason that Hanukkah is the only Yom Tov that has a Rosh Chodesh in the middle. Because Hanukkah is, what is Rosh Chodesh? It's renewal. It goes darker, 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 and then suddenly there's light, there's a moon. And that is the essence of Hanukkah. We were in the midst of darkness up to our neck, and then it became spiritually and physically glamorous and dynamic, bright, full of light and luster. Now, Parshas Vayeshev begins with the story of Yosef and his brothers. And you know there was terrible jealousy. The pasuk says, Vayekanu vo echav. And I'm going to take 2 or 3 minutes to say something for our new listeners, because I did get a few calls of people who for the first time would be listening this evening. And I know I've said it on 2 or 3 occasions in the last 3 years. So for our regular listeners, forgive me for a little bit, and I'm going to do it very quickly, repetition. And for our new listeners, it will be a little bit of an eye-opener for you, because the fact is that in our parsha, Yosef HaTzadik, and he's the only one. Look through our Doros, Avram Avinu, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They're called Avos, Avosenu. Moshe is Rabbeinu. David is Hamelech. Aaron is HaKohen. But Yosef is Tzaddik. And throughout our generations, very few have been given that title Tzaddik, because it was because of his tzidkus that the whole world was fed. You see, the shoirish, as Sfarim, Kabbalah Sfarim say, to Parnasa, and to be able, that's why tzaddikim, their Parnasa zocha nasa al yedei acherim. They never had to close their Gemara or their Zoyar or their Kisvei Ari and go out to work. How did they live? Someone showed up that wanted to support them, or a group of people wanted to support them. That's Zocha Melachton Nasa al Yedei Acherim. Yosef was able to be the tzinor, the pipeline for sustaining the world in food, and he was the shliach to do it because of his tzidkus. Because of the tzidkus. Now, we know that his brothers went and kidnapped him and sold him. As the pasuk says in this week's Sedra, be'esrim kesef, for 20 coins. And I've said to you at least 3 or 4 times that for those 20 coins that the Chazal say, the Medrash says that they went and bought new shoes. We don't wear shoes on Yom Kippur. And it's a kapara because Yom Kippur is a Yom Tov. It's not Tisha B'Av. It's not Avelis. And if someone's sitting Shiva before Yom Kippur exempts him completely because it's not Avelis. But we don't wear shoes, not because of Avelis. We don't wear on Yom Kippur as a kapara for what the brothers did. 3,000, more than 3,000, 3,300, 3,500 years ago. Now, the law, the halacha is that if someone kidnaps, it's a lav. If someone kidnaps and gets money for it, they're chayav misa. So the Zohar Kodesh asks, so why weren't they killed? The Shiftei Kah. And it answers and says there was no malach or soraf that was capable of inflicting a punishment of death to any of the Shiftei Kah. The malachim, srafim, oifanim, all of them couldn't challenge the Shiftei Kah. They would have been destroyed in a minute. So they had to be nisgalgal 1,600 years to Asar Haruge Malchus, and that's when they were killed. They were all Gilgulim, with the exception of Ruvain, because Ruvain was not there. He was by Kibbut Av, back at home. He wasn't there by the selling. So Reb Elazar Reb Hyrcanus, who had the neshama of Ruvain, he didn't have to be killed. And he was walking the street. The Romans left him alone. The others they were looking for and they were searching for and they wanted to grab them. And those who they grabbed, they killed over the 52-year span. It didn't happen like people think. They took out one Tana and killed them, and 2 days later the next one. It was over 52 years that took place, the Asara Haruge Malchus. But the point is that the Shivtei were very, very great. And before they went and grabbed Yosef and put him into the ditch, into the bore, and then pulled him out and sold him ended up in the house of Potiphar, they sat down as a bezdin, a rabbinical tribunal, and they paskined that he was chayav misa. He was chayav misa. He had the death penalty because they thought he wanted them dead. He was going home. The basam ra'a el avihem, and bad-mouthing the brothers to gather the wrath of Yaakov Avinu that they should end up dying. And that's why they sat down, and that's what they paskined. So if that's what they paskined, the question is, there was a psak bezdin. So why did Yehuda suddenly stand up and say to them after they threw him into the pit, what are we doing with our brother? Let's take him out and sell him. If there was a psak din, why was Yehuda having second thoughts about what they did? And the answer is because there was some tingling in him and the brothers. Did we paskin with negias or without negias? We paskined. And we paskined he's chayav misa, and that's why we threw him in the bore to die. But thinking about it, there was a lingering little voice. Maybe because there was such jealousy, you couldn't see straight in your psak. And that brings me to share with you that it says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. I don't have to tell you who Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, he was of the biggest Tanoim ever to live. And the Gemara says that his Talmidim came to visit him in his last days of life. And they came in and he was crying. So they asked him, Rebbe, why are you crying? I mean, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had the biggest Tanoim as Talmidim. And he said, because now I have to go up to heaven, and I have to give a din v'cheshbon, and if I was going before a human, a mortal king who has flesh and blood, and he's a human, I would be shaking if I had to go be judged by him life and death. So by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I shouldn't be worried about who he's going to paskin, what he's going to say to me. Am I muchan and mezumant for olam haba, or am I destined for the opposite place? So they said, Rebbe, patish yemini amud hachozok I mean, they said such terms that you're the greatest of the great. How could you think for a moment that you may be destined to Gehenna? So, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, the Meforshim all ask, what was he troubled by? Now, we know that he was at the time of the Churban, and he was so great that he was the one that was allowed to ask to go speak to the Tsar in Rome. And they granted his request that he could come for an audience with the Tsar. And he asked for 3 things when he went into the Tsar. The first thing was he asked for Yavne v'chachomeha. There was a city in Eretz Yisrael that was packed to the gill with wonderful Talmidei Chachomim, scholars beyond scholarship. And he asked that they be spared. You're coming in to destroy everything. Let them live so the glory and the fruitfulness of the Torah, which is such a magnificent vehicle of learning and knowledge, and that, let them live, so there should be continuity. And the second thing he asked for was that Rabbi Gamliel, who was from the lineage of Nesiim, remember the Gemara is full of stories with Rabbi Gamliel and others, his descendants, of what they paskined, and the halacha went like them, that they be able to also have continuity and let him live. And then the third thing they asked, there was a very big tzaddik named Reb Tzadok, that he needed desperately medicine and they were not letting anything in. And the Tsar granted him all 3. They never destroyed Yavne. They never killed Rabbi Gamliel or his children. And they let in a ton load of medicine for Reb Tzadok. So the Gemara asks, why, if he was being granted things he was asking for, why didn't he ask that the Beis HaMikdash not be destroyed? And there's maybe 50 terutzim why he didn't ask for that. Some say he thought that it would be too much, and then they would give him nothing if he asked for that. There's a whole slew of terutzim why he is. The Gemara even says could be he forgot. He was so overwhelmed by being granted the audience and coming in and asking for Yavne that he forgot to ask. But whatever we say, he did not ask for that. Now, at the time of the Churban, there were some Turkish youth, the Gemara says, and they had a different opinion. All the elderly Tanoim said the way to deal with Rome is to engage them in conversation and in a nice way to try to gain some footage. But these Bar Yoinim, these young Turks, they say, oh no. The only way to deal with the Romans is to fight them tooth and nail. Now the Chachamim said no. But what the Bar Yoinim went and did, the Gemara says that there were silos of grain. And there was so much grain that Klal Yisrael could have survived for 21 years, the Gemara says, fighting the Romans. They had enough food. And these young wise guys, these Bar Yoinim, went and burnt down all the silos. They wanted to bring it to confrontation, that they would have no food and the whole Klal Yisrael would have to go fight, which is what happened, and they lost and they burnt down the Beis Hamikdash. So the Meforshim say, of course, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was not a fool and he didn't act falsely what he thought that he was going to end up in Gehenna. But what bothered him was that he thought that when the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, that could there be a possible thought, 1%. You see what ended up happening? I told you not to fight the Romans, but deal with them in conversation, compromise it. So you see, I was right. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, now right before his Petira, thought, I'm coming into the heavenly abode. Maybe they're going to have a taina to me that my opinion and my whole formation of what I thought should be and could be was afflicted by my personal drop of wanting to prove my point was right and that you were wrong. And maybe I could have saved the Beis Hamikdash if I wouldn't have been of that posture. And that's why he was crying before he was nifter. Yehuda was very criticized that he allowed his personal, he very criticized. The Gemara says that the Shvatim says, we're going to talk about it in just a moment, that Vayered Yehuda, that his brothers put him down. He lost the prestige. He was supposed to be the Melech. And they said to him, you were our leader. When you came back and thought maybe we paskin with a tinge of the kinna that we had against him. So it wasn't a pure psak. And that's why you wanted to pull him out. And we listened to you because you were the leader. Why didn't you say, let's bring him back to our father? Our father is going to be sitting and moaning and groaning for 22 years. Why didn't you push us to just bring him back home? We would have listened to you. But no, because maybe there was a tinge of that kinna. You didn't want to bring him back home. You wanted him in trouble, okay? Maybe not afterthought to kill him, but to get him down to Mitzrayim, who knows what's going to happen to him. But that wasn't your cheshbon. You came with a different cheshbon. And that's why the two places in our Sedra that the Lashon of Hurad, of Vayered, is by Yehuda and by Yosef Hatzadik. That he went, Hurad Mitzrayim. They brought him to Mitzrayim. And from those two, we know that Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David, the main Mashiach that we are waiting for is Mashiach ben David. And that's from Yehuda. And the other Mashiach, most tzaddikim 200 years ago said already came. Some said it was Reb Shlomo Karlina. Some said it was the Baal Shem Tov. that was Mashiach ben Yosef, which is completely a different darga, and that is history. But Mashiach ben David is what we long for and say every day in Shemona Esrei 3 times, that Es Tzemach David Avdecha Meheira Satzmiach. That's what we're waiting for. And Yaakov Avinu was Yaakov Avinu in Parshas Vayechi, when he gave a bracha to every one of the children, he gave a bracha to Yehuda, Ato Yoducha Achecha. You see, in our parsha, we have a story that Yehuda's had 3 sons. The first one was Er, and Er married a girl named Tamar. Now, Er did not behave. He didn't want her to become pregnant, so he did an Avera, and he died. So there was a mitzvah of Yibum, and Yehuda married off his next son, Onan, to Tamar. And he did the same thing, and he died. Now there was a third son, Shelah. And Yehuda, in his mind, really al pidin, he had to give Shelah Yibum, to marry Tamar. But inside his mind, he was afraid that the same thing will happen, and he's going to lose his third son now. So he gave her an excuse that, listen, Shelah is young, and let's wait till he gets older. And Tamar saw she never violated her status, because someone that is zakuk liyibum, that someone that has to have yibum, and today we don't do any yibum, because if you don't do yibum, that means the brother doesn't marry the wife of the deceased brother 100% l'shem shamayim, that he's oiver and arroyos. It means, let's say the sister-in-law is very pretty, and in his mind he's happy to marry her because she's so pretty. That passes the yibum completely, because normally a sister-in-law can't marry the wife of a brother that died, but the Torah was matter with the mitzvah of yibum. Today, therefore, we only give chalitza, which is given today, nebuch lo aleinu lo aleichem, in cases if there is a death, and normally there would be the mitzvah of yibum, but we don't do yibum. He gives chalitza. So she was sitting there waiting for yibum. And after years, and Shelah started to grow up, and Yehuda never gave him. So Tamar saw Baruch Kodsha, this was a holy woman, that from her and someone in Yehuda's family, that there was going to be Doros and that Mashiach was going to come out. So she masqueraded herself like an improper woman. And when Yehuda went traveling on the path, he saw her, and he didn't, the Medrash says, didn't want to do anything with her, but the Malach forced him. And he lived with her, and she became pregnant. So they went back to Yehuda, and they said that Tamar, your daughter-in-law, obviously committed adultery because she's zakuk liyibum. She had no business getting pregnant and being intimate with someone else. She still has to end up marrying Shelah. So Yehuda said that's the halacha, that she was the daughter of Shem, that she has to go out, that's Koyanim. She should be put to death. And they were taking her out to kill her, and she called out and said, "Where are you taking me?" And she held up, because when Yehuda was intimate with her, she asked for payment. And he gave her his mata, his staff, and he gave her psilim, wicks, and his choisim, his ring. And the Mekubalim talk about, why is Hanukkah right always around Vayeshev? Because when it says chosamcha, that he gave Tamar, that's a remez to the chosim of the Kohen Gadol on the jug of oil. And mateh is the staff of the Kohen Gadol and the candle that we light the psilim, and the psilim are the wicks of the Hanukkah lights. And that's the remez in our Sedra, being mashpia on the Or HaGonus. So she called out and said, whoever owns these items, that's the person who was intimate with me, and I became pregnant. And Yehuda, at that point, called out, Tzadka mimeni. He was standing, it says in Chazal, in front of thousands. And most leaders in such a situation, which would embarrass them to the core, he admitted, yes, it was me, because she felt al pidin I wasn't giving her Sheila. And she knew that something had to come out from her, from our family. So therefore, she was saved, and she, with the twins that were inside of her, were not put to death. So when Yaakov Avinu was on his deathbed, when he was nifter in Parshas Vayechi, he said, you're getting the malchus, because a melech has to take the backbone and stand to survive humiliation and admit that he was wrong. And he was wrong to take her out to try to put her to death, because it was from him. He didn't know it was her. She was masqueraded completely. And she was ready to put the decree of being put to death, no problem, rather than embarrassing him and saying, you're the one that said I should be put to death. You're the one that She didn't say that. So Yaakov Avinu said, you're going to be Melech Yisrael, because a Melech has to have that backbone to be able to embarrass himself, but rise above the occasion and admit you were wrong. Admit the guilt. Exactly what Yehuda at that point did. So when we come to Sukkot and we say, says the Bnei Yissaschar, that when we say the Hoshanas and we go around with the Sifrei Torah, we have the Sifrei Torah stand, and we go around 7 times the Bima, we, in one of the stanzas, in the 3rd group of comments in the holy Hoshanas, is Omani Choma, and one of the statements is Damsa LaTamar, that the Jewish people are comparable to Tamar, to a date tree. Tamar is a date tree. And it says in Chazal that, let's say there's a hurricane, so everything could go down, but not the date tree. It is strong and it is resilient. And that's what Tamar was. She was ready to be thrown into the fire and not to embarrass Yehuda, which could have saved her in a moment. So Klal Yisrael is Damsa LaTamar is comparable and compared to the date tree that is fortified and resilient and tough. That was Tamar. So says the Bnei Yissaschar that when we say Damsa LaTamar, which means resilient like the date tree, it's a reference to the Tamar of Ar Sedra, the wife of the sons, the daughter-in-law of Damsa LaTamar, that rather than embarrassing Yehuda to stand up to an ugly fate, but to be resilient and not to give in, that Klal Yisrael has lived through the generations of resiliency rather than bowing down to the idol or baptizing or whatever and choosing to be burnt at the stake rather than to give up their golden faith by which their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers lived and died. Now, it says that we know that there's a story with Yosef, and that's why it's back to back, because the two Mashiachim came from it, because as ugly as the stories look on the surface, that Ashes Potiphar wanted to seduce Yosef, that was the only thing that saved us. When we got to the Yam by Kriyas Yamsuf, the only saving factor was because the whole Pamalya Shalmala said, Rabbanu Shalom, what are you saving the Yidden for? They deserve to be saved? Halalu ovdei avodah zarah, v'halalu ovdei avodah zarah. They were all, the Mitzrayim were serving avodah zarah, and so were they. Until Hayam ra'a vayonos, until the sea saw vayonos vayetze hachutza, that Yaakov Avinu withstood the temptation and ran out. Now there's an opinion in the Gemara that he was ready to do the Aveira. Lasos Tzorochav, that he was finally couldn't give in, and he was going to live with her. And then he saw in the window the Yukna Shel Oviv. And Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky said on this Chazal that a father has to know that the currency that he has with a son could either fortify him or not. It was that currency. When Yaakov Avinu said to him, do you know that there's going to be a Choshen Mishpat on the Kohen Gadol? And it's going to be every one of the Yud Beis Shvatim there. And it's going to have Ruach HaKodesh and light up what to do, what not to do. And you're supposed to be on it. But instead of being on it, there'll be an announcement that you hung around with the women of ill repute instead. And that shook him enough to run out. And when the Yam, the Sar Shel Yam, by the Kriyas Yamsuf, saw Hayam Ro'o Vayonos, that he saw that Vayonos Vayetze Hachutza, he said, oh, maybe Klal Yisrael doesn't deserve it, but Yosef HaTzadik does deserve it, and I'm going to split because of him. So we see the power of Yosef HaTzadik, and Yosef's ability to be saved by his father. And Rav Yaakov, the Rosh Yeshiva Zichrono Livracha, said that everyone has the responsibility to build and fortify and nurture relationships with their children, because in many cases there will be a test in the lifetime, and the reflection of their relationship with their father, if it was a strong one, the person's going to say, I can't do this. My father never would have done this. My grandfather never would have done this. That kesher has to be fortified and maintained. Now we know at the end of the Sedra that Paro got angry at his butler and his baker, and he threw him into jail. And they had a bad dream, and Yosef, who was in jail then, because Yosef had said that he was thrown in by Potiphar because of that libel, that lie that she said that he wanted to seduce her. And you see, her kavanah wasn't so bad, because she said to Yosef, listen, if you don't want to be with me physically here in this world, I'm perfectly happy that you should be with me in Olam Haba. But I see we're supposed to be together. Her mistake was that it was the girl, her stepdaughter, Osnas, who was the daughter of Dinah, who had to be with Yosef and subsequently became his wife, and he had Menashe and Ephraim. But she thought, the pasuk says, Lishkav etzla liosima. Lishkav etzla, to live with her here in this world. Liosima in Olam Haba. Now, a woman that just pure seducing people doesn't talk about Olam Haba. So we see that the story is not so simple to grasp and to understand. But he was thrown into jail, and when he was asked by them, by the baker and the butler, to interpret the dream, so at the end he said to the butler, you're going to live, in 3 days you're going to be restored to your royal position as royal butler. And to the baker he said, in 3 days you're going to be destroyed. You're going to be killed. You're going to be hung. And it happened exactly like that. Now, to the butler, before he left on that 3rd day, Yosef said to him, please remember me. And he said two lashonos v'his kartani, and then he also said zachartani. So it was twice he asked the butler that he remember him to Paro, to get him out of the jail. And that's what happened, because Paro had a bad dream. Next week, Sedra, Mekates, and it was the butler who said we were in jail, and it was this Hebrew boy who interpreted, and he was right on target. I came back, and he was hung. So Paro got him, and that's how Yosef became the viceroy in Egypt, in Mitzrayim. But Reb Meir Simcha and Reb Chaim Briska once had a conversation, and Reb Chaim asked, because the Gemara says, because he mentioned to this butler twice that the butler, remember him to Paro, and he was like putting his marbles, his hope on him, and not totally HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he had to spend 2 extra years in jail. He was supposed to be there 10 years, and he ended up 12 years. So Reb Chaim Briska asked Rav Meir Simcha from Devinsk, Rav Meir Simcha, he asked him that he went for 2 extra years to jail. What would have been if he would have only asked and said one word? So he answered him and said then he only would have been in jail 1 year instead of 2 extra years because of the 2 times. So Reb Chaim Brisker answered him and said, no, he wouldn't have been in jail at all if he would have asked and said V'hiz Kartani. Because in Olam Hazeh you are allowed to be mishtatev. You're able to do whatever you can to save yourself. That's called derech hateva. We're living in a natural human world, and he should have been given that ability to ask. So if he would have asked only once, he would not have been in jail any extra years. So said Reb Chaim Brisker, back to Reb Meir Simcha. So from this we see that we are allowed, when we want parnasa, we want good children, we want refuas and yeshuas, we want the geula. We here, the vehicle is the davening and the ma'asim tovim that we do to be able to achieve it and to be able to pull ourselves out from a situation of where we are and not have criticism. Even though we have to put our trust in HaKadosh Baruch Hu, He is the one that can do it from beginning to end. But we also cannot just sit back, as I say, on a hammock and drink iced tea and hope from heaven. Now, like I said at the beginning of this year, tzaddikim that are kadoshim, really kadosh, they can have parnasa without the work. Zocha malachton nasa al yedei acherim. And that's why Yosef, because of his tzidkus and kedusha, was able to be the one to provide the tzinor, all the shefa of having parnasa for the world. It wasn't just Mitzrayim. The whole world was suffering, and they were coming down to Mitzrayim, to Yosef, to be able to survive. We hope that all the lessons of Parshas Vayeshev, and next week we will speak, of course, more. The shir will come out Motzoi Shabbos, a day before Chanukah, and I will be speaking on Chanukah about the beautiful Yom Tov of Chanukah, that we could be zoicha not only in the Chanukah menorahs to the Or HaGonas, but be zoicha to Kol HaOlam Kulo, to the Or HaGonas of the worldwide population.